Poetry for me was really a way to try and understand something that I didn't understand. For me, when I wrote that collection, I was doing it because I had just lost my dad to a drug overdose. And that was very difficult and very challenging to understand. So I started writing immediately and I wrote really ferociously in my journal, just as much as I could possibly remember. Because when I lost him, I was afraid that not only had I lost him physically, but also that my memory would fade and I would lose him again. Terminology. In the months that followed, I would learn the terminology of grief, read outpourings on blogs, collect informational leaflets, buy more than one book with a woman crying on the cover. I worked on pulling these poems together in a coherent way and trying to figure out a structure for them so that they not only offered these snapshot moments about what it was like to grow up with someone who had a drug addiction and what it was like to lose them, but that the whole collection could then tell a sort of story, a bigger story, and ask bigger questions about not only who my dad was, but also what it means to lose someone that you have a complicated relationship with. Lesson number 3. He asked me to wait by the window and watch as he slit the throat of our pet turkey. I saw the whole thing. Its head bobbing, blood splattering, my sobs fogging up the glass. Later, to comfort me, he said that some things were never meant to be loved. So, one of the things that I found the most difficult about this book was striking a balance between recognizing the sort of villainous or difficult things that my dad did are the things that made him maybe not a very good man or not a very good father, reconciling that with the good things that he did, and trying to show that addiction was only one part of who he was and that there was much more to him than the thing that took his life. And that was very important to me, to communicate that in the collection. And so the final poem in the collection is really about recognizing that and about recognizing who he was. And it's called Finding You. Covered in tick bites and sweat, I found my way to the music store you'd talked about. The man behind the counter knew your name and mine, shook his head when I told him the news. Such a shame, he said. Then I realized it. This had been your place. Not the flea-infested house or the beaches full of needles, not the bloated body on the bed. I had found you here. When the man brought out the guitar, I cried more than I ever have in public. He said you came in every day for 2 months before you chose the perfect one for me. As I was finishing the first collection, some of the early poems from How to Carry Fire were starting to be born. So I was trying to move away from grief. I think a lot of writers, um, toward the end of working on a project, get really excited and follow their curiosities and passions for other projects. So I started to write about Wales and what it was like to live in Wales and also the landscapes that are here. And I wrote a little bit about the landscapes of my home as well in Doylestown in Pennsylvania. Ode to Ottsville. I want that time again when geese were a child's only enemy, when fear was just bats emerging from the paddocked barn. Suppose I started writing this, back in 2014, 2015, so 7 years ago. And originally, this poem was going to be a bit of a love letter to these landscapes. And it focused a lot on these places and also on the ocean and how the ocean divided both America and Wales and what that kind of depths of the waters meant and the distance between these two places, both like the emotional and physical distance. But in the middle of writing this second collection, my brother, who has a heroin addiction, relapsed. And it kind of turned my world upside down. I thought that our father's death would mean that he would be okay. And I was sort of naively optimistic and hopeful that, we were going to be a family in a new way. But then he relapsed, and I felt the same kind of fear and anxiety about losing him. that I felt toward the end of my father's life. And so I started to write into that and write into that fear and write about my brother. And we were having lots and lots of conversations every day, or every week. And during those conversations, it all seemed to come back to this house fire. We lost our home in a fire, our childhood home where we grew up. And my brother sort of blamed that for all the things that happened to him, or sort of saw that as the catalyst. And the more that I thought about it, the more that I could see that that was such a pivotal moment in our lives. I mean, that was the moment when we lost the house, that my brother's addiction spiraled out of control, that my father's addiction spiraled out of control. That was the catalyst to my mother leaving my father, leaving this domestically violent relationship. And it was also the catalyst for me to leave America. It was the beginning of me deciding that I wanted to start a new life somewhere else. Insurance report. After the fire, we had 48 hours to produce exact numbers. How many forks? How many pairs of underwear? How many items in the fridge? Unable to remember every object, we were only certain of what was lost. The stained glass unicorn, the Sioux tribe necklace, our grandfather's final brick. We cried out for these totems. Who are we without them? Who are we? Only the inspectors answered back. But what were they worth? What were they worth? I've realized that here I was writing the language of water and land, and actually what this book needed was the language of fire. And I needed to go into the fire and pull out all of the things that, all of the destructive things that fire can do for us or can do to us, and all of the cleansing things that it can give us. So I started to write lots of poems about fire, metaphorical poems, figurative poems, and literal poems, about this house fire, and also about what fire meant in my life and the kinds of fires that I carried within myself, and that my family carried. So that's sort of how the collection was sparked and born, and how it developed.